Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game. So, I got a fun and exciting video for you guys today because another Super Nintendo CD prototype unit has cropped up and been acquired by a museum. And since I've been talking about the unit, considering Kosam the Great is working on reverse engineering and remanufacturing them, and you know if you watch my channel, I love some rare video game hardware. We're definitely going to be deep diving into that Super Nintendo CD prototype today, as well as what it does, what it wouldn't do, and where it is currently residing and where you can go see it. Because honestly, even though the Super Nintendo CD never really existed, console hardware is definitely something that fascinates a lot of people, so it is a topic that it's always fun to talk about. Before we get too far involved though, do me a huge favor down below, hit like and subscribe and ring that notification bell, definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined and want to support the channel, I got a Patreon link down below as well. And if you haven't watched my videos on Kosam the Great's recreation of the Super Nintendo CD as real hardware, I will leave a link in the description below. And if that name sounds familiar, that is because Kosam is the one that developed the Sega Neptune PCB that I featured on the channel both as a bare PCB as well as a full custom build. Kosam just goes out and decides if consoles didn't exist, he may as well go ahead and make them a reality. So maybe sometime in the future, this fall, next year, you can actually build and play your own quote-unquote Super Nintendo CD, reviving something that never actually released into consoles that you could hold in your hand. Now taking a look here, the National Video Game Museum acquired a new prototype of a Super Nintendo CD, and based upon its design, I have seen photographs of this before, and it would be the earliest example of what a Super Nintendo CD could have been. You'll see here it's marked as MSF-1, and I'll explain what I think that might mean in just a moment. But honestly, these things do not pop up all the time. I've got a few pieces of development hardware in my collection, and I've got a few one-of-a-kind items as well. These are the type of things that basically show up once or twice in a collector's lifetime, and it's definitely awesome it's shown up here. And if you're not super familiar with the Super Nintendo CD in general, basically think about the Sega CD, except think about a console that really didn't have any additional horsepower. And there are two different Super Nintendo CDs technically. There is the one that was in development with Sony, and then the one that was in development with Philips. We are talking about the Sony Super Nintendo CD, which would go on to basically form the basis, at least as a concept of making a console, of what the PlayStation 1 would be once Nintendo basically screwed Sony in that deal. But again, I want you to think about this piece of hardware not as the Sega CD, because that actually had more hardware on board that would actually increase the graphical and performance capabilities of the Sega Genesis base, and then basically give you a more powerful piece of hardware. At its heart, the Sony Nintendo Super Nintendo CD was nothing more than basically a new storage medium that could load that data as well as the Red Book audio into the Super Nintendo or Super Famicom, giving you more storage space, full motion video, but not really any better performing games. Now if we take a look here at the actual photograph on display, the first one at least, MSF1 I assume is Multimedia Super Famicom 1. This was probably the first actual unit developed, and you can clearly tell, unlike some of the other case designs we've seen, this is just bare metal bent to go around the PCBs inside. Unfortunately, no photographs actually exist of the boards, but I'm sure they're pretty bodgy and probably very prototype status. And you will see here we have some buttons as well: Remade mode, fast rewind, fast forward, play and pause, and stop. Pay attention to those buttons because they're going to come up in the more fully finished prototype as well. So you can clearly see, even though this is a basic model, it is very indicative of what it would become in the future. And this is definitely based upon the Super Famicom version of the hardware, because you can tell by the cartridge slot, and basically at least in this first dev unit, you can see that it was supposed to actually attach to the Super Famicom in and of itself, versus actually having something like a full unit. And interestingly, just last year as well, we found that Ken Kutaragi, no surprise there, the father of PlayStation, actually has another unit in his possession, and you will see here those same buttons are available. Fast rewind, fast forward, play, stop, everything else is going to be basically the same. So this prototype was a very early version of what you see in this all-in-one case, and I'm really not sure, and I don't think anyone is sure, whether or not Nintendo was planning on selling it as an add-on, as a whole unit, or maybe both. Now taking a look around the side, you'll see the power in, basic DC, with the polarity mark there, and you'll see the drive IF as well. But here is the pass-through connector to go into something like a Super Famicom. You will also see there's a drive select for external or internal, as well as a power switch. Definitely going to have one of those. So basically this would have slotted into an actual Super Famicom, and then you could have loaded discs up from there. At least that is the presumption as far as the actual software is concerned. And it would have sounded a little bit something like this in practice. So you definitely would have gotten Red Book audio out of the Super Nintendo CD, and you would have gotten full motion video as well, but like I said earlier, unlike the Sega CD, you weren't getting any graphical enhancements. But as far as the overall design philosophy is concerned, it seems to be mirroring the Super Nintendo CD to the Sega CD, because obviously if Nintendo was going to release a CD add-on or a CD console, they would want people that had already invested into the Super Famicom or Super Nintendo in the US not to have to ditch that hardware and buy it again just to have a CD-ROM drive on board. And even though those final prototypes you saw basically had the actual Super Famicom inside of them, I'm sure that was something that just actual Sony would be selling. Now on the front here, you're going to see you get a little LCD display, definitely not mounted in there well because again it is a prototype. You have an indicator that the power is on as well as a busier access light for the actual CD-ROM drive. You have the slot here because the CD-ROM would actually go into a caddy if you remember those, and you have an eject button because obviously you're going to have to get that disc out somehow. Versus something like this Ken Kutaragi's model where you can see the control ports for the actual station are there and everything else would basically be built into an all-in-one console. And that definitely is something that I wish existed, and in some alternate dimension definitely does exist, and maybe in our dimension might exist soon, because there is actually a case design out there that you can manufacture, and hopefully one day if Kosam the Great finishes up the Super Nintendo CD PCB that you can actually harvest chips from different consoles on and build yourself, that we can actually live in a world where this hardware does exist. But again, remember, there isn't really anything you can play on it outside of one fan game, because this thing didn't get far enough into its development lifecycle to have many prototypes actually made as far as games are concerned, and what did exist out there, I have never seen a single dump or mention that anything has survived, so it's one of those things that'll take the fan community to actually make games for it. But honestly, that's definitely something I would love to see, because we see retro gaming fans do crazy stuff all the time, and honestly that's why retro gaming is making a comeback. It isn't just enough to talk about old retro games, people go out now, recreate new retro hardware, and make games for it. We have consoles that basically never existed before that are in development right now, so people are doing all manner of absolutely insane things in all of the best ways possible. It definitely makes me happy to see stuff like this, because everyone is always painfully curious about the Super Nintendo CD, so the fact that it could actually be an accessible thing that people could play around with in the future is just straight 10 out of 10 fun. Imagine being able to sit down at your Super Nintendo and play some of the MSU1 versions of those games, except on actual quote-unquote real hardware. And again, if you've never played any of the MSU ROM hacks, that's what I'm displaying here, where you see a full motion video, because MSU1 in some ways is basically a virtual recreation of what the concept of a Super Nintendo CD would be. It is silicon, but it isn't actually manufactured. It's mostly an FPGA to create an actual multimedia add-on for the Super Nintendo that never truly existed. And again, it's not like that is new. Retro gaming fans have been doing crazy stuff like this for a long time. And this is why you end up seeing stuff like Mario and Zelda games on the Philips CDI, because after Nintendo broke that partnership with Sony, Sony would go on to make the PlayStation 1, Nintendo would partner with Philips to make a Super Nintendo CD. That would fall through, but Philips got the rights to make some games. But imagine if your Super Nintendo CD sounded something like this. I mean, think of it this way, if there are multiple dimensions, we are living in one of the worst timelines, because somewhere out there, Nintendo actually released a CD add-on either with Sony or with Philips and made a bunch of amazing 16-bit games with the power of CD-ROMs behind it. Instead, we got the luck to live in the timeline where that didn't happen, and Philips got the rights to make some Mario games and some Zelda games, which are hilarious for all the wrong reasons, but honestly, not the most fun things in the world to play around with. But the reality of the situation is, hardware and evolution were moving so fast back in the 90s, by the time Nintendo actually probably decided that it was time to try to make a CD-ROM attachment, by that point in time the Super Nintendo was old enough and they realized new hardware was on the horizon. It kind of becomes a moot point, because in the 90s things were changing so quickly. You go from basic stuff like Super Nintendo at the beginning of the decade to having the Dreamcast by the end of the decade with its own GD-ROM format and 3D that felt basically like magic. So it's absolutely amazing that this new prototype Super Nintendo CD exists, and I would love to see some photographs inside of the PCB, so researchers and myself included can kind of go through the silicon and see exactly what's going on. But I got a lot of questions about this when the news came out, and I figured I would talk about it. And I have one more Super Nintendo CD video coming as well. Like I said, I'll probably do that late next week or the beginning of the one after that. If you have any questions or comments, leave them down below and you tell me, do you remember the Super Nintendo CD rumors from back in the day or not? Bye-bye.